Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Improving Restorations webinar series. My name is Gina Quirum. I'm going to turn on my video here. And I'm going to be helping to moderate and host this webinar today. I'm going to run through the slides that we're going before the webinar started and just make sure that we're all up to date on logistics. First, again, welcome to the webinar. And I want to point out that this webinar series is a partnership between University of Minnesota Extension and the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. And we have teamed up here to offer a series of free webinars for professional development. Then these are really focused on improving restorations in Minnesota and beyond. This is the first of 4 webinars that we will be offering. They will be every 2 weeks at the same time. And if you registered, you should be able to access all 4 with the same link. So hopefully we'll see you again. Today we have 2 speakers for you, and we're going to be talking about the value of record keeping and good record keeping in restorations. First, Bill Schuna is going to be sharing some of his experience. Bill is with the Minnesota DNR, and he is an area wildlife manager for Slayton and Talcot Lake Wildlife Management Area. Prior to that, he was the assistant wildlife manager from 2001 to 2013 in Marshall. He received his BS in Fisheries and Wildlife from the University of Minnesota in 1999. And Bill is going to kick it off after I finish up with a little housekeeping here. Secondly, we're going to have Dr. Matthew Kaproth from Minnesota State University Mankato present today. He is a plant ecologist at Minnesota State University Mankato, and there he investigates prairies and oak systems to understand what management leads to their success and how these species have adapted to their environment. And he's going to share some of his experience kind of digging into restoration records. A little bit of logistics for today. We are going to save about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of this webinar for questions. So we highly encourage you to ask questions. Please use the Q&A feature to do that. And you can see right here what the Q&A feature looks like. If you're having trouble finding it, just poke around until you see the 2 little kind of text box bubbles and the Q&A under it. If you're having technical issues, you can also use the chat feature, and someone will try to get back to you and help you troubleshoot. After the presentation, when the webinar is done today and you close Zoom, a pop-up will come up with a short survey. We would really appreciate it if you would fill out that survey. We're going to use that information to help improve future webinars and guide future content. So let us know what you think. Also, if there's something that you missed in today's webinar, or you want to share this webinar with someone after it's over, we're going to post a recording of the webinar on the same site where you registered. So we will share this link in a variety of ways, but know that that recording will be available. Like I said, there's 4 webinars in this series for the spring. There's 3 more coming up. In 2 weeks, we're going to talk about teamwork and project teams in restorations. And then we'll have a webinar focused on stream restorations. And then we'll dig into lakeshore restorations a little bit more specifically. This is a partnership between University of Minnesota Extension, specifically the Restoring Minnesota program. If you're not already familiar with the courses that they offer, you might want to check out the Ecological Restoration online courses. This is a series of 5 courses designed to provide early career professionals with practical skills to undertake common kinds of restorations and solve problems. The courses will be offered again beginning in late August, and you should be able to register starting at the beginning of June. So again, we'll send out more information about that. I also wanted to mention here the other partner, the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. This is a joint program with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and Board of Water and Soil Resources. And we evaluate restorations in the state of Minnesota, collaborating with experts to figure out what's working and where there are ongoing challenges, and share that information to try to improve future projects. So that's part of our goal today. And that is all I have. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then Bill, if you want to take over and take it away, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Gina. Try to get my stuff to work here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. The share screen disappeared. And I don't know what happened to it.
Do you see a bar that has kind of like the Zoom info on it? You can kind of hover over it. Sometimes it pops up about there.
Bar with Zoom in.
Bill, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a bar that has participants, Q&A, chat.
Yeah, it's not, it disappeared for some reason. Maybe I need to minimize this. There it goes. I got it now. Something happened. I think it's the screen. Can you see it now?
I see your screen. Yep, there's your PowerPoint. Perfect.
All right, great. Thanks. First day with my new technology. So today we're going to be discussing reconstruction record keeping. Why keep records? It informs the funding entities. Their funds were wisely spent. It may help secure future funding. It supports collaboration. It does take a village. Provides opportunities for monitoring and evaluation of reconstruction success, which of course helps future reconstructions, and provides a legacy of what was done so new managers don't have to make it up. That isn't fun, making it up. When I started with the DNR in 2001, typical seed mixes included 5 species of native grasses and maybe 15 species of native forbs. The grasses made up the majority of the mix and the forbs played a minor role. Roughly a half a pound per acre, sometimes a quarter pound per acre, depending on funding. One seed mix, usually Masic, was developed with the idea that self-sorting took place, and all work was documented on hand-drawn maps. In the end, Big Blue Stem eventually dominated the reconstructions, and Megan Bennett shared a photo, the wall of Big Blue Stem you see there with a fire break mode between it. And as the title says, science is our guide and evolves. So doing the same thing over and over while hoping for a different result is the definition of insanity. Past documentation and monitoring has proved this. Collaboration is key to getting better outcomes, and collaboration with a certain regional ecologist help foster change for the better. And there she is, that's Megan Bennett. Megan Bennett, she's our Region 4 ecologist out of New Ulm. Megan has been very, very helpful in us changing our ways for the better. And as the next bullet point says, DNR land managers have changed their approach to prairie reconstructions. We all know change isn't easy. It wasn't for me. So currently we plant many species and have included sedges and rushes along with forbs, making sure we fulfill functional groups. Diversity matters. We develop mixes based on soil drainage class and topography, so seeds planted are adapted to the site conditions instead of having to self-sort. We also account for microhabitats by adding specific seed mixes to match site extremes like dry hills and wettest wetlands. And as everybody knows, GIS technology has come a long, long way in helping us with our planning efforts. Seed mixes now contain approximately 50% grasses, sedges, and rushes, 50% forbs. And the forb portions of the mix include species of early, mid, and late season bloom periods, which provide pollinators with adequate forage throughout the season. And for us, we're striving for 50 seeds per square foot overall in our reconstructions because we plant in the fall with a broadcast seeder to give the forbs time to stratify, which we think improves germination. I'm sure most would agree. Here's an example of a map we prepare for seed mix development. We overlay LiDAR on top of the soils, and in this case, the red shapefile or polygon is is the hilltop, and it's eroded. So that's a short grass mix with dry adapted species. And then the blue is the wet masic mix, and the tan is the masic mix. Here's an example of a seed mix wish list. Of course, you can't see the whole spreadsheet, but once the mixes are developed, we send them off to DNR buyers to procure bids from our vendors. It's over my purchasing authority, so I can't do this part. When the bids come in, we decide what we'll purchase based on cost and seed origin. And seldom do we get everything on our wish list. There's things like the puccoons, the panic grasses, we can't get those from our vendors. And many species present in our local native prairies are unavailable from our suppliers due to difficulty, like I mentioned earlier, difficulty in harvesting, propagating. And as everybody knows, less than 2% of the tall grass prairie remains in Minnesota. So the seed sources are scant. Now we're using tractor mounted GPS precision guidance systems to plant our prairies. There's Ken Scott on a field day a couple summers ago with Dennis Peterson. He works for Shooting Star Seed. We were evaluating a section of land that Ducks Unlimited bought that Kent planted using the GPS. And there's the GPS unit we're using, the Easy Guide 250, the tractor mounted GPS unit. And here's an example of a planting guide map. The tractor mounted GPS system we have, you cannot upload shapefiles in. So you have to either flag the field to identify the seed mix boundaries, or what we've been doing is just uploading GPS waypoints into a handheld unit, and he's driving the tractor along from point to point to point to identify the field boundary, and then he fills it in with the Easy Guide system. And there he is planting prairie. And then here's an example of a documentation map. After the site gets planted, I get a hold of the master seed tags from the vendors. And when they come in the bag, there's a seed tag on every bag from the vendors, but it just shows what's in that bag. So I want everything that's planted or that we purchased for the site, and they send that off. It's a PDF file. I just copy and paste into a spreadsheet, and then eventually I'll copy from the spreadsheet into these call out boxes. It's fairly easy. Little space bar and commas after each species. It's not difficult. That's all I have. That's what we've been doing for record keeping. And I guess questions are coming later.
Great, thanks, Bill. I think it's always helpful to see some of the tools that people are using in their record keeping and some examples. So thank you for sharing. I guess at this point, I would welcome Matt to take over and share his screen and jump into your experience kind of working with restoration records and how you engage with that in your research.
Sure. Can everybody see my talk?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Okay. So I wanted to kind of let Bill give some really good examples of what the DNR is currently doing, and then kind of go and present a little bit of what I was working on with a recent graduate, a master's student, Ainsley Peterson, who was in my lab. Ainsley did some big surveys in 2019 with a couple students looking to try to assess the success of different conservation efforts across the southern part of the state. And we were able to take a look at that, looking at remnant and restored sites and trying to wonder what is causing success, what's impacting this. And it all relied on having really good site information. And we spent a lot of time, I'll say, Ainsley did a lot of the work of trying to identify like what were the site histories, what were the factors and different ways that we can measure success. And so I'll be able to share some results that we have from that and kind of some ties to what we thought were helpful for us to understand what's causing success in these prairies. So we did 31 prairie surveys. There was 22 sites, but some sites are split up. Maybe they had different times, that the amount of time that they've been restored for. One was started a decade before the other, or maybe there was some geographic split, and we parsed them up a bit. But we wanted to look in part at private prairies, thinking about lands that had received some federal or state dollars at some point for restoration. A lot of those were owned by prairie enthusiasts, a group that's based out of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois. And we also looked at some public sites, or we considered the Nature Conservancy and the DNR managed lands to be public. And we visited those in what we thought would be the peak of the growing season, June, July, but also in August. But if people remember 2019, that it was a pretty cool spring, and the phenology, everything was kind of delayed a bit. So we did a follow-up survey in August and try to take a look at that. And when we're looking at these details, we had a couple things that we really kind of wanted to pull out from a site before we surveyed. And it's really vital to know what you have before you start doing anything on a piece of property. We were thinking about kind of having a reference point and knowing where that site has gone or been over the past decades of management, or even longer. And land use history, of course, we were trying to separate a little bit between remnant sites that had never been plowed up and restored. We also wanted to understand a little bit about the sites, what type of soils they have, what the hydrology is, what the geoposition is in terms of hills and hollows. And we also wanted to know, and this is vital for your work, thinking about what species are there. Are there any rare species? Are there invasive species? Because the presence of certain species will guide what type of management you would want to use at those sites. If you really want to be taking care of a state concerned species, you might be a little bit more careful managing around that, especially if you're doing different types of like disturbance management, fire, chemical, or mechanical. So we just want to kind of think about the reference point of a site before you start doing anything. And it's probably good for the winter time, but if you ever are able to dig up the land surveyor notes of a location, you might be able to find some interesting detail about a site. A lot of land surveyors kept notes of major trees or rocks or other landscape features in their notes when they're describing a section, and you might be able to pull that up and understand something unique about your site. And if you are trying to burn away some of the winter days, this could be a good thing to kind of dig into. When we were thinking about restoration and kind of doing these surveys, we noticed that not all sites had the original records, or maybe consistent records, or even the original note taker. I mean, that happens. It involved a lot of phone calls and a lot of back and forth to try to get site information for these 31 prairies. And we would really love it if it was possible to get, complete records and having improved records that are easily accessible. And we didn't dive into the seed planting info that Bill just talked about. I would like to do a follow-up to understand like what was planted at these sites, if there was a restored site, and try to think about how that impacted the results we're about to see. The big things that we wanted to dive into, besides knowing if it was a remnant or restored or public or private, was also the management histories. What type of mechanical, chemical, and fire frequencies have there been at these sites? When was the last time it was done? How many times has it been done over the last 10 years? Is it continuous over the whole site, or is it just by spot? And then I think something that I don't see very often that could have been really useful is the when, specifically not just year and season, but maybe even the phenology, trying to think about like, all right, was it early enough in the growing season that there was no C4 warm season grasses growing when a fire was put down. Were there only prairie smoke and flower at the time, or golden Alexander in flower at the time when the treatment was applied? Or was it peak growing season for some warm season grasses? And I think that could have some pretty big impact for the results we see of success in a prairie, trying to understand some patterns here. So I'll just try to give you a couple examples here of what we did and then some results. When you look at a site, what's success? What's success of a prairie restoration or maintenance of a restored site, or sorry, a remnant? And some might be pretty obvious to kind of think about the amount of species diversity there is, native species diversity, and then the amount of invasive species cover. And we were using the vegetation monitoring tool, time meander that Bowen and Gladowicz put together 2016. And I know you're going to hear from Dr. Gladowicz in 2 weeks as one of the panelists for this, and she might be talking about this a little bit more, but just kind of give you an idea what we were doing. About every 5 acres or so for a small site, you do a 30-minute meander just kind of through the parcel and try to identify different things about the site. And you would increase the amount of meanders that you do based on the size of the site. So you need to know about the site history in terms of geoposition and how long different parcels have been managed before you start doing these. You need to know the size of the site before you start. But in general, if you have a site that's less than 5 acres, you do 1 meander. If you have something that's between 5 and 6 or 59 acres, you're doing 2 meanders, and you can keep on including more and more meanders as the sites get bigger. And so if you were going to go out on a 40-acre parcel, you would try to find a way to split it up before you even get out there, and you would do 2 meanders, and you are just wandering through trying to identify every single species, but also you're going to be writing down the cover of each of those species, especially the invasive species, how much of the landscape is covered by that species. And so for data collection, we were out on these 31 prairies, and we were identifying plant species and whether they were not, they were invasive or not, and the amount of cover they had. We had the site info for management history in terms of mechanical or chemical or fire. And we had to know a little bit more about the sites to be able to think about their history. And now we're able to kind of put that together and compare successes of these sites. And I will just flash this up at some point here. This will be recorded. You can kind of go back and look at them. But if anybody has any questions about these sites, you can kind of share some data. Hopefully in the future, we're looking to publish this info. And some results we saw were, this is an odd figure to look at, histogram, just species richness. There's a lot of variation in site species richness in terms of just number of species that we saw. And in general, we did a follow-up on the August sites only in a couple spots because of that delayed phenology. We saw that in August, the species richness was increased, more than 20% higher number of species that were able to be identified than the June and July surveys. But in general, there was a really wide range of different conditions that were, or richness that we were seeing about these sites. All right, and then going a little bit further, this is an interesting kind of result that you're able to get from doing these surveys. You're able to assess every site in the same way and try to take a look at some of the patterns that we see. And there's 2 different axes I'll kind of point out to for you. Looking at the sites, we were working all with native plant community classification of upland prairie. And each upland prairie has a list of species that are associated with it. And at the bottom axis here, we have % native plant cover or native vegetation. And it's based off of a list of species that occur in those upland prairies. And if you have say 35% of the plants on your list, then you're able to plot over here on the x-axis and understand where it falls compared to other prairies. And on the y-axis is something that you don't really want to have a lot of. This is the invasive species cover, and this can add up to 200 because you can have overlapping canopies, but you're kind of thinking about like how much cover are each of the invasive species that you noticed on your surveys. And from these surveys, you're able to kind of bin up or split up the different types of sites that you have. The sites that fall on this bottom right are going to be high quality prairies, and they have low invasive species cover and higher percent native vegetation. You can have some examples of medium quality, and those can be both maybe high in native species, but also high in invasive species cover, or they might be low in both of those two components. And then finally, you can end up with a low quality site that needs maybe a reduction of invasive species cover, but also an enhancement of the native prairie plants. So from these surveys, we were able to see actually no difference between the private and public sites in June and July. There was not a significant difference in ownership, which is probably a good thing in terms of thinking about maybe that private land management is doing the same thing as public. But in August, when we got to a slightly higher species richness, we did see that public lands are being managed in a better way in terms of this line here shifted to a higher richness on the on the public lands. So we saw an improvement in that public lands had higher species richness or native species richness in August. So from these type of results, we're able to find maybe why some sites are better than others. And if you're able to get good documentation for these sites, you're able to maybe gather some recommendations and try to look at all the patterns that we see. And it's kind of a fun way to look at this in a scientific manner, be able to pick up some reasons of why sites are better. And management histories are one of the biggest things we wanted to look at and how they lead to better biodiversity or higher biodiversity. All right, so my big take home I want to emphasize, because we looked at this in every single different direction in trying to understand why things were doing better at some sites than others, why you have a high quality site compared to other spots. And the biggest thing was fire frequency, the amount of times that fire is put onto the land per year in terms of maybe over 10 years, specifically over 10 years. We saw that a site that had high frequency of fire, maybe they were burned 8 out of 10 years or 7 out of 10 years or 5 out of 10 years. Those sites in general had a higher diversity metric. We were using phylogenetic diversity here. That's something similar to Dr. Dan Larkin has used in the past. And we were seeing that annual fire frequency is the best tool for trying to increase the diversity of species richness that you have. And I'll kind of emphasize, because we expected to see some other things in here too, but chemical and mechanical management did not correlate with higher species richness and did not correlate with higher phylogenetic diversity. And that was surprising, and that held up across a lot of our different types of surveys. We did see that in general, the kind of some patterns that also helped us tie to invasive species. So we noticed that a couple of invasive species were really prevalent on a few sites. Maybe there was 8 invasive species that were really nasty. And there are some ways to keep them in check. In general, the last mechanical disturbance or last chemical disturbance was negatively tied to the percent cover. So in general, the more frequent you had last done a mechanical disturbance or a chemical disturbance, it helped knock down white sweet clover. All right, so that is a useful tool for trying to manage white clover. Something that is maybe useful if you're trying to manage for higher amount of species richness is to maybe target hoary acelum. We found that the cover of hoary acelum is tied to species richness in a negative way. And in general, that the higher the amount of hoary acelum cover, the lower the species richness that we had for a site. So in general, we know that there's a lot of different ways you can kind of customize your management, and it really helps if you know about your site history. You're able to compare your site to other sites, and maybe you can kind of customize the approaches that you use. It's really important to be able to keep important detailed records, maybe the specific phenology, the date of when management happened. That'd be awesome if people were able to write down what was happening in what was in bloom, what was growing, what was in peak form at the time that you applied a management or a pesticide, or what type of management you were specifically using. And it might be very, very helpful to have live copies, as in like files that are available to share or editable, and other people can look at them at least and be able to see what they are, because there's a lot of potential for management improvement if we're able to see the notes, improve documentation that's available for other people to compare to. And I was kind of getting to this, and I think it might be one of our questions later, is just trying to think about improved documentation, trying to archive data that's available for other people to pick up. And maybe having shareable files, something that's a living document, something that can be edited and still be available on hand for everybody. And I know different organizations are going to have limitations in terms of what's shareable or who has access to things, and that's okay. You can set permissions for some things, but files that are within Google Docs or Dropbox or Office 365 might be shareable and editable and living, and allow for maybe easier access to be able to do some of these comparisons. All right, so that's my notes that I have to show you, and we can dive into questions.
Great. Thank you, Matt and Bill, for your really excellent presentations. And I've been monitoring the questions, and we will get to as many of them as we can. So one of the questions for either or both of you is, what is your biggest challenge in documenting restoration information? What challenges have you encountered, and how have you overcome them?
I can take that one. Time. These are, for me, it's a winter activity for the most part, because I'm out in the field for the most of the field season. So usually I have time in the winter. Just have to have no interruptions, that kind of thing.
I feel like for me, the biggest issue has sometimes been getting the notes taken in the field to translate directly into an imperfect way into your notes that you type up. Do you remember everything at the moment that you're writing everything down in the winter time that was happening in the summer? So I wonder if there's some information that's lost. But yeah, time is going to be one of those big issues, but then sometimes also the availability. We unfortunately had to reject some sites from our study because we didn't have enough information going back 10 years. And it looked like 10 years was the more important kind of resolution that we needed. We can't just think about 1 year or 2 years away.
Great. And a follow-up question for you, Matt. You just mentioned, sort of there being cases where there weren't sufficient records, but also, was there other information that you wished you had that didn't tend to be recorded in restoration records?
I didn't get like the seed planting info from a lot of folks. The seed mix labels or the seeding information wasn't complete, and people would take pictures of tags, but then they were like, yeah, but then we added in some extra seeds too, especially some of the private land ownership. Like they would augment something, or they had got something available just on the fly once, and they didn't have complete records of that. So I mean that's going to happen. There's also going to be seeds coming in from other sites too. So I mean dispersal happens as well, but we wished we had more information on the seed mixes, I guess.
Somebody is involved in doing a buckthorn removal and forest restoration with a DNR grant, and is wondering who they could contact that has experience keeping records that might be able to help guide them with good record collection. Or if not an individual, if there are maybe resources that you know of that you could direct them to.
So I can jump in on this one because we've actually evaluated a number of projects like that and have seen some people that are keeping really good records. And actually one of them is a future webinar speaker, Kyle Arola. So he is a DNR employee up in the Thief Lake wildlife management area. And I can put his email in the chat. Is that maybe the best way to go?
Thanks, Gina.
Mhm.
Somebody has a question about historical site information and, you know, sort of what processes either of you have gone through to gather historical information, and, you know, was it difficult to find older records?
For us, most of the reconstructions we're doing are on cropland. So we could look at the 1938 air photo, which we have access to for most of our work area, but it was mostly likely cropland, broken prairie at that point. It's great for wetland restorations though. The 1938 photo, a lot of the old aerial photos, we use that. And of course the soil data really helps.
I know for myself, going to the county building in Blue Earth here, I was able to pull out some information for site histories. They just have reams and reams of giant old books sitting on the shelf that nobody's looking at most of the time, but a lot of the notes are there for property parcels. But I mean, it's painstaking. It's like doing genealogy work in terms of trying to piece together all the bits of information that might be available, and it might not have anything. It might just be just a couple map lines on a piece of paper, and there might be no notes there. So it's kind of maybe for fun, but maybe it'll tell you something.
Great. A question for Bill. Bill, how has your record keeping changed over time? And can you share a specific example of a benefit that you have seen from good record keeping?
Well, as I mentioned in my PowerPoint, we used to keep records with hand-drawn maps. The map was, you overlay FSA aerial photo on a light table, and we were drawing the pictures, the seed, the planted area outline on those maps, and then writing down the species that were planted. Back in the day, we were purchasing cultivars, and the flowers were supposed to be from native prairies, but we've changed a lot in how we're doing things. We're buying local ecotype seed. So we are keeping all the seed tags, an example from each bag, the seed mix. We're starting to do this, putting it on a spreadsheet. That was just in the last few years. And in the last few years, I suppose we've been putting the species planted per mix on the map too. So in the future, the next 5 years, well, you only get to do these things once. It's pretty expensive. This seed is really expensive. So we want to try to do it right the first time. I lose sleep over this. One of my former instructors at the U of M is on this call right now. We only get one chance to do it. So I want to be able to go after I retire with this map in hand and go to those sites and see, is what we planted persisting out there? And if it doesn't show up in the first years, did we put it in at a high enough rate? Do we have to change our rates on some of these species? Like butterfly weed, you can plant it in a reconstruction, and we've noticed on one site that it doesn't look like we got what we purchased. And some of that has to do with germination. Butterfly weed is really hard to get to germinate. And another one is lead plant. We put it on almost all of our restorations. But when you're planting into bean stubble, you don't have the soil mycorrhizal fungi anymore. It's all been tilled in the past. So you're starting out from scratch. So it takes many, many years for that lead plant to show up, if ever. So those are the things that these records will help to improve future reconstructions.
You mentioned, potentially waiting a long time for lead plant to show up, and that ties into another question that was in the Q&A about, how you tell apart which species are there because you seeded them in versus which species might have shown up on their own from natural establishment.
Like goldenrod, some of the goldenrods float in, but the heavier seeds, probably if they were in the seed bank after tillage and herbicide for eons, Roundup, I'd be pretty surprised if they were still there. Some of when they do scrape outs for wetland restorations, you'll have propagules underneath that eroded, the hilltops. What we're finding is the hilltops are ending up in the low spots. So all the good organic soil is in the low spots. And the hilltops are just clay now. And if you look at aerial photos from in the recent past, you'll see that out this way, and probably in a lot of farm country, where the whole hilltops are blown off. So so these wetlands, if you do the scrape out, expose the propagules, you will get, in many cases, most cases, you'll get those wetland plants without having to plant anything. But they're buried under sometimes 6 inches to a foot of topsoil. So,
right.
Does that answer your question?
You think about amount of fragmentation now around a lot of sites. There might not be a lot of native seeds to blow in from other spots if they're being released new. But yeah, you're talking about buried seed bank. There definitely is still a seed bank for some species, but I am curious about trying to do more genotyping and trying to be able to trace down, all right, are you getting seeds, or are you getting plants that came from your seed mix or from the local landscape? And I know the Echinacea project has been working on this a little bit up near Alexandria with purple coneflower, but I would love to be able to see more surveys of looking at genotypes or within species variation on these sites.
There's another question, sort of noting that, public entities or larger private organizations might have, sort of more staffing and capacity for record keeping, and asking if you have guidance for, private landowners or other kind of smaller scale restorations. Any guidance for collecting and maintaining their own data for, themselves or future research or management.
I was curious about this. I work with the Bell Museum as a herbarium curator myself. We have our own herbarium. I'm not sure if maybe our herbaria could act as a way to kind of deposit some information like that. I don't know right now for private lands. Maybe the prairie enthusiasts themselves could also do something similar. But where could we archive some of this information that's available from private landowners, or maybe even also have a place for public information also aggregate? It'd be great to be able to put all this information into one big spreadsheet, one kind of like GeoBIF kind of example where you can get all these site information, right? And herbariums are already kind of set up in that way. So the biodiversity atlas through the Bell Museum that has like individual plant records, but I'm wondering if we can do parcel community records. That would be something that would be really outstanding to have. And I'm curious what other people are thinking. Like, how can we do this?
When private landowners do some of this work, if they work through the Soil and Water Office or the Natural Resource Conservation Service, are there records there? I would think there'd be some good records in those places.
Yeah, that was actually one of the questions in the Q&A, is if it's possible to get past land use info from USDA if the land is in CRP or other programs. Sounds like
It's private data though, a lot of it, from what I remember.
Matt, you mentioned the Bell Museum, and do either of you have recommendations on whether or not to collect voucher specimens from restorations for herbaria?
I'm always torn by this. I mean, I come from a mindset of, you know, being able to have a voucher specimen, taking a plant in peak form maybe and pressing it and putting it in a shelf somewhere. But then if there's only 10 of those plants, I don't want to do that to the population. But I know nowadays when I saw some people putting it in their iNaturalist, or just being able to take a photo or taking a pic and posting it. That, I mean, that's at least an observation or record that can be available for the public information, and be usable for scientific investigation. But then of course you don't have the actual physical specimen to look back on later. So small populations, I would leave the plants. Large populations, please do collect and press and label, and we'll take things like that in our herbaria. That'd be great.
There's a question about the possibility of seed mix contamination with invasive species. Is that something either of you have found evidence of in your work?
Yes, yes, and yes. Queen Anne's lace has come into a few of our restorations or reconstructions, and we've been hand pulling it, but it happens. I'm pretty certain it didn't blow in if it's way in the middle of a section. So, but that is spreading in this countryside with mowing roadsides. It's spreading all over the place.
I'm sure people are going to have different stories and try to figure out what has popped up in their properties. I'm curious. We had a whole bunch of mullein just go crazy after a new kind of parcel was set aside and planted with a bunch of local ecotypes, and we had red clover and mullein just take over, and we were hand pulling that all, at least the mullein before it went to seed, and I'm not sure where those seeds came from, other than maybe they came in a seed mix a little bit, or maybe they were in the soil seed bank, and I don't know how long those seeds can sit there. So I'm curious, but yeah, unfortunately, there's always going to be a little bit of contamination, maybe a lot of contamination in some seed mixes.
We've gotten.
Sorry, go ahead, Bill.
We've gotten native forbs from southern Iowa, northern Missouri in some of our stuff in the past. Hopefully they will not persist. The populations are small enough they can be pulled, but with climate change, maybe those are going to be adapted to southern Minnesota, who knows. But there's a Monarda species, I cannot remember the name of it, but it was present in one of our reconstructions last year. I took some photos and sent it to the buyer, and so we're documenting all that stuff.
Another invasive species question. for either of you, are there particular invasive species or noxious weeds that you commonly see as problems in these restorations? Do you have kind of a, you know, top 3 or 5 of concern?
For us, it's Canada thistle with the noxious weed law, and especially now we're planting 50% forbs to grasses. The last thing we want to do is either mow. I mean, that's the least damaging, I guess, but spraying with herbicide, if you go out and spray that thistle, everything in the composite family is dead with the herbicide we're using. So it is so counterproductive. We're working with the county weed inspectors and asking them for patience, because if we don't take care of it, it can escalate to the Department of Agriculture, and then there's a powwow with the commissioner, and we don't want to go there. So we're trying to educate folks that it takes 5 to 7 years for the forbs and grasses to outcompete the thistle. If we get a complaint and it's a real big patch, we'll mow in the first years because we have to. There's just no way around it with the noxious weed law.
For us, we kind of had like the big 8 for our surveys. They had the highest amount of frequency, and we found them in all sites. Phalaris rondaceae, reed canary grass, bromus, intermis, smooth brome grass, ramus, catharca. You got buckthorn, both of the sweet clovers, yellow and white, mellotus, and thistle, of course, and then also Horia coelum, Berterola. I'm always going to mess that one up. Those are some of the nasty ones we had, and yeah, thistle makes nobody wants to deal with that one either. But we were really trying to find maybe some ways that what was helping to knock them down, and I think really spot treatment or individual kind of like reduction of small isolated populations are going to be the best way to go to start with. But we didn't find, other than doing some mechanical or chemical treatment on the white sweet clover, we didn't really see a lot of perfect ties to how to manage those species. Every site's different.
We've been very plant-centric in our discussion so far, and so I guess combining a couple questions, do you have any thoughts about documenting, monitoring for animals, whether that's wildlife or insect communities? Any recommendations there?
For us, non-game they've begun doing invert sampling on some of these reconstructions in the prairie Kaproth. So that's been helpful. Finding out that ground nesting bees show up in these reconstructions. It's amazing. You build it, they will come. Of course, pheasants, we don't drag for nests or anything like that, but they show up. Waterfowl, all the non-game birds, well, not all of them, but you build it, they do come, but we aren't like counting or anything, doing any population monitoring that way for those.
There was a request for more information about the timed meander, and I know Matt, you put up Bonin and Gladowicz 2016, and Sue is on as well. If either of you could sort of point people in a direction so that they can learn more about the method and maybe be able to implement it themselves.
I know it's easily available. That the whole method is posted up on the LCCMR website, I believe, but Dr. Gladowicz, you might have a more easy way to access that. We can always post up the citation for the full method, but it's a recommended method to be used for assessment of land that gets, or projects that get funded through the LCCMR.
you know, as Matt mentioned, it's you know, if you prefer to just look for it through LCCMR, but if that seems like it's kind of tough to find, just go ahead and email me. I'm pretty easy to find at the U, and either Julia or I will send that along to you.
Thanks. What about documenting the seed sources that are going into your restorations?
Those are documented.
Could you comment more on that, Bill? Like what kind of record keeping, how you manage that type of record keeping?
It's in a spreadsheet when they purchase the seed. We go through the buyer and us. We would go through species by species, and if cost and origin, you'd look for the lowest cost and the closest origin to your site. And we'd kind of do a sequencing with our seed deployment. I don't have an example of that map. I was digging for it the other day. But you look at your site and then you go as close as possible and then go out from there and out from there for the seed. And the last one we did reject a whole bunch of seed from Canada. They're offering seed from Colorado. That kind of thing. We try to keep it as close as possible.
There were some questions about fire management. And I guess one of them, you know, sort of related to the question about animals is kind of, you know, reconciling the benefits of fire management in terms of plant diversity, like Matt showed, versus the possibility of, you know, too much fire or fire at the wrong time being harmful for butterflies or other priorities. Do either of you have any comments on that?
Right. The general recommendation is you're not going to be burning your full site every time. You hopefully are always leaving a little bit of it, and maybe before you even do your burn, you're driving through your prairie like you're a distracted driver or something, making fire breaks. You want to make sure that there's some heterogeneity in the site, and maybe a spot that the animals can refuge during that disturbance event.
I agree. We try not to burn more than a third. And you look at the whole landscape too. Not just the wildlife management area that you're burning. If there's other prairie offsite, that is still a refuge that you're not burning. So no more than a third, and we seldom burn the same site more than once every 5 years. We just don't have the staff to do that at this point. We're using cows and haying for other disturbance.
That was my next question, so I'm glad you brought that up. People are interested in whether grazing is being used for management in any of these systems.
Yes, and haying. But grazing is, especially flash grazing in the spring, I've seen some really good results where they're out there for the month of May. So just like a burn. And they're leaving a little fertilizer on top of it. And so we've seen some really good response.
The sites we surveyed did not have grazing on it. We did look at kind of total chemical, mechanical, and fire, to see if all three of them added together had impact, and it was just came down to fire being the most important, but grazing might be a whole different story.
Well, I want to thank you both for really excellent presentations, and thank you attendees for your questions. We had so many great questions coming in, and I'm sorry if we were unable to get to yours. Please don't hesitate to email one of us, either the speakers or Gina, myself, Julia, if you had a pressing question that we weren't able to get to. We would all be happy to respond. And please come back in 2 weeks on Thursday, March 18th to hear from Kyle Arola of Minnesota DNR and Sue Galadowicz of University of Minnesota on the importance of teamwork in restoration. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah.
So long, everyone.
See ya.
Thanks. Good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. That was great.
Dan,